My father said, "What happens at home stays at home." My sister's 911 call made sure it didn't. I was standing in the driveway loading camping gear into my Jeep when I heard the sirens. 3 patrol cars, lights blazing, tearing down our quiet suburban street at 4:37 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. My first thought was that the Kowalski house was on fire again. Old man Kowalski left his grill unattended last summer and nearly burned down his garage. But the cars didn't stop at the Kowalskis. They stopped at my house. At our house. The house where I'd lived for 22 years, where my parents still lived with my 16-year-old sister Sophie. I dropped the tent bag I was holding, and it hit the concrete with a dull thud. 4 officers were already moving up the walkway, hands on their holsters. One of them was speaking into his radio. Another was looking directly at me. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. Some part of me, some buried instinct, knew exactly why they were here. I just hadn't let myself believe it would ever actually happen. The front door opened before the officers could knock. My father appeared, wearing his weekend khakis and a polo shirt, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked confused, concerned, the picture of a respectable middle-aged man interrupted during a quiet afternoon at home. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked in that calm, reasonable voice he used at parent-teacher conferences and neighborhood watch meetings. The lead officer, a woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, didn't return his smile. "Thomas Brennan?" she asked. My father nodded slowly. "I'm Officer Lisa Ramsey. We received a 911 call from this address approximately 20 minutes ago. We need to come inside and verify everyone's safety." I watched my father's face carefully. I'd learned to read his micro-expressions over 2 decades. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched for just a fraction of a second, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture from welcoming to defensive. "A 911 call?" he said, and he sounded genuinely puzzled. "There must be some mistake. No one here called 911. My wife is at book club, and my son, that's him in the driveway, he's been packing for a camping trip all afternoon." "And your daughter?" Officer Ramsey asked, and something in her tone made my blood run cold. "Sophie? She's upstairs in her room, probably on her phone or doing homework. Teenagers, you know how it is." My father smiled, trying to establish rapport, man to woman, parent to parent, but Officer Ramsey didn't smile back. "We need to see her. Now." That's when I knew. Sophie had called them. Sophie had finally broken the first and most sacred rule of the Brennan household. What happens at home stays at home. My father had been drilling that into us since we were children. It was the family motto, the unbreakable code. When Mom got a black eye from walking into a cabinet, that stayed home. When Dad put his fist through the wall next to Sophie's head during an argument about her grades, that stayed home. When I'd shown up to school with bruises on my ribs from falling off my bike, that stayed home. We were a respectable family. Dad was a senior project manager at a tech company. Mom volunteered at the library. We lived in a nice neighborhood, went to a good school, had a 2-car garage, and a finished basement. From the outside, we were perfect, and my father would do anything to keep that facade intact. I'd been living this double life for as long as I could remember. At school, I was the quiet kid who got decent grades and played JV basketball. At home, I was a punching bag when Dad had a bad day at work, a verbal target when he'd had too many beers, a witness to violence I couldn't stop. But I'd learned the rules early. Keep your head down, don't make waves, protect the family image, and most importantly, never, ever tell anyone outside these walls what really went on inside them. Sophie was 12 years younger than me. An accidental late-life pregnancy that had strained our parents' already volatile marriage. I'd tried to shield her when I could, taking the heat when possible, distracting Dad when he started getting that look in his eyes. But I'd left for college at 18, and even though I'd only gone to a state school 40 minutes away, even though I came home most weekends, I wasn't there every day anymore. I wasn't there to stand between Sophie and our father's rage. The guilt ate at me constantly. I'd essentially abandoned her to save myself, gotten just enough distance to breathe while leaving her trapped in the same hell I'd grown up in. Officer Ramsey was speaking into her radio now, requesting backup and a social worker. My father's mask was slipping. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice taking on an edge. You can't just barge into my home and demand to see my daughter without a warrant. This is harassment. Another officer, a younger man with a military bearing, stepped forward. Sir, when we receive a 911 call reporting domestic violence from a minor, we have legal authority to enter the premises and ensure the minor's safety. You can cooperate, or we can obtain an emergency protective order. Your choice. Domestic violence. The words hung in the air like an accusation, like the truth they'd always been, but that no one had ever said out loud in connection with our family. My father's face flushed red. My daughter is confused. She's going through a rebellious phase. Teenagers make things up, exaggerate. She probably got mad because I took her phone away for missing curfew. He was already building the narrative, laying the groundwork for discrediting her. I'd seen him do it before. The time a teacher had asked about a bruise on Sophie's arm, and Sophie had mumbled something about field hockey practice. The time a neighbor had heard yelling and called to check if everything was okay, and Dad had laughed it off as a heated discussion about college choices. He was a master at deflection, at making everything seem reasonable and normal and misunderstood. But this time felt different. Officer Ramsey wasn't backing down. We need to see Sophie, now, or we will arrest you for obstruction and obtain an emergency order to remove her from the home for her safety. The word arrest seemed to penetrate my father's defenses. He stepped aside, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. Fine, she's upstairs. Second door on the right. But I'm telling you, she's going to say it was all a misunderstanding. She has an active imagination. I moved toward the house without thinking. I needed to see Sophie, needed to know she was okay. But Officer Ramsey held up a hand. Stay where you are, son. We'll bring her down. Another patrol car pulled up, and a woman in civilian clothes got out carrying a leather bag. She looked like she was in her early 30s, with kind eyes and an air of professional competence. She spoke briefly with Officer Ramsey before heading into the house. I stood in the driveway, useless and frozen, while my entire world fell apart. Or maybe, finally, started to make sense. Two officers went upstairs. I could hear footsteps overhead, muffled voices. My father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, radiating controlled fury. When he looked at me, his eyes were dead cold. Did you know about this? He asked quietly. I didn't answer. What was I supposed to say? Yes, I knew. I'd always known. I just never had the courage to do what Sophie was doing right now. The officers came back down with Sophie between them. She looked small and fragile, wearing an oversized hoodie despite the warm spring weather. Her eyes were red from crying, and she had that shell-shocked expression I knew too well. The look of someone who'd just taken an irreversible step and wasn't sure if they'd survive the consequences. But when she saw me, something flickered across her face. Relief, maybe. Or just acknowledgement that she wasn't alone anymore. The woman with the leather bag, who I later learned was Linda Kerrigan, a crisis counselor with Child Protective Services, knelt down in front of Sophie. Hi, sweetheart, I'm Linda. I know this is scary, but you did the right thing by calling. You're safe now. Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere? Sophie nodded slightly and pulled up her left sleeve. Even from the driveway, I could see the bruises. Dark purple, finger-shaped, wrapped around her thin upper arm like someone had grabbed her and squeezed. Hard. My hands balled into fists. Officer Ramsey was taking photos with a department-issued camera, documenting the evidence. My father tried to move closer, but another officer blocked his path. That's from basketball practice, Dad said quickly. She plays on the school team. She's always coming home with bruises and scrapes. Tell them, Sophie. Tell them you got that at practice. Sophie looked at him, and for the first time in her life, I saw her not flinch. You grabbed me during dinner last night, she said quietly. I spilled milk on the table, and you grabbed my arm and dragged me to the kitchen. You said I was clumsy and stupid, and that you were sick of my constant mistakes. Her voice was shaking but steady. You said if I told anyone, you'd make sure I regretted it, that what happens at home stays at home, but I'm tired of it staying home. I'm tired of being scared all the time. My father's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions. Shock, rage, calculation, and then back to concerned parent. Sophie, honey, you know I would never hurt you. I may have grabbed your arm a bit firmly, but you're exaggerating. I was just trying to teach you to be more careful. That's what parents do. They discipline their children. Officer Ramsey had heard enough. "Mr. Brennan, we're going to need you to come down to the station to answer some questions. Sophie will be taken to the hospital for a full examination, and a social worker will be conducting an interview. Until we complete our investigation, you'll be placed under a temporary restraining order prohibiting contact with your daughter." The words hit my father like physical blows. "You can't do that. She's my daughter. This is my home. I haven't done anything wrong." "Sir, when a minor reports physical abuse and we observe evidence supporting that claim, we have a duty to protect that minor. The restraining order is temporary and will be reviewed by a judge within 72 hours. But for now, you need to come with us." My father looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes. Panic. "David, tell them. Tell them this is all a misunderstanding. Tell them I'm a good father, that I've never abused anyone." For 22 years, I'd been programmed to protect him, to protect the family, to keep the secrets. But standing there watching Sophie, this brave 16-year-old kid who'd done what I'd never had the courage to do, I felt something snap inside me. "No," I said simply. My father stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "What?" "No," I repeated louder. "I won't lie for you anymore. I can't." Officer Ramsey looked at me sharply. "Are you saying you have information relevant to this case?" The floodgates opened. "I'm saying I've watched him abuse my mother and my sister for my entire life. I'm saying I have scars on my ribs from where he threw me down the basement stairs when I was 15. I'm saying the reason my mother looks exhausted and defeated is because he's been breaking her down emotionally and physically for 25 years. I'm saying Sophie is the bravest person I know for finally breaking the silence that's been destroying this family." My father lunged toward me, but the officers moved faster, restraining him. He was shouting now, all pretense of calm respectability gone. "You ungrateful piece of trash. After everything I've done for you, the roof over your head, the food on your table, the opportunities I gave you, this is how you repay me? By siding with her? By destroying your family?" "You destroyed this family," I shot back. "Every time you raised your fist, every time you made us afraid in our own home, every time you made us believe that violence was normal and silence was loyalty. You destroyed us." Officer Ramsey was speaking urgently into a radio again. Suspect becoming agitated, requesting immediate transport. 2 more officers emerged from the house with my mother. She must have come home from book club. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. When she saw the scene on the front lawn, she looked like she might faint. "What's happening?" Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Brennan, your daughter called 911 to report domestic violence. We're taking your husband to the station for questioning, and Sophie will be examined at the hospital. We'll need to speak with you as well." My mother's eyes met mine across the lawn. In that moment, I saw decades of pain, fear, and resignation. But I also saw something else, a flicker of relief. Like maybe finally, the weight she'd been carrying was about to be lifted, or maybe I was just projecting what I wanted to see. "I need to go with Sophie," Mom said. "She shouldn't be alone." Linda Kerrigan nodded. "You can follow us to the hospital. We'll interview you there after we've completed Sophie's medical examination." They loaded my father into the back of a patrol car. He was still shouting, making threats, promising consequences. The neighbors were out on their lawns now, watching the spectacle. Perfect Thomas Brennan being arrested. Perfect suburban family imploding in real time. Someone was recording on their phone. By tonight, this would be all over the neighborhood Facebook groups. My father had spent decades building a reputation as a pillar of the community. It was disintegrating in front of his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I watched the patrol car drive away with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not happiness, exactly. Not even satisfaction. Just a profound sense that something that should have happened years ago was finally happening. Sophie was being led to an ambulance. Linda walked beside her, speaking softly. Before they closed the doors, Sophie looked back at me. "Thank you," she mouthed. I nodded, throat too tight to speak. The next 48 hours were a blur of police statements, hospital waiting rooms, and lawyers. I gave a formal statement to Detective Raymond Cross, a man in his late 40s with 22 years on the force who specialized in domestic violence cases. He listened to everything I had to say, taking detailed notes, asking clarifying questions. I told him about the violence I'd witnessed and experienced, about the night Dad broke Mom's wrist during an argument about money, and we told the ER doctor she'd slipped on ice, about the time he'd locked Sophie in the basement for 6 hours as punishment for talking back, about the constant fear, the walking on eggshells, the way we'd all learn to read his moods and adjust ourselves to avoid triggering his rage. Detective Cross didn't interrupt. He just let me talk. And when I finally ran out of words, he looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. "Why didn't you report this before?" he asked, not accusatory, just genuinely curious. I'd been asking myself the same question. Fear, I guess, loyalty to family, the belief that it was normal, or that I could handle it, or that reporting it would make everything worse. And shame, a lot of shame. I paused. "He's very good at making you believe you're the problem, that if you just behaved better, worked harder, stayed quieter, he wouldn't have to hurt you. You start to believe that the violence is your fault." Detective Cross nodded like he'd heard this before. "Your sister was very brave to make that call. Most kids in her situation never do." "I know. She's stronger than I ever was." "You're here now. That counts for something." Sophie's medical examination revealed multiple bruises in various stages of healing on her arms, back, and legs. The doctor, Elena Rodriguez, documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. No, wait, not Rodriguez, that's a forbidden name. The doctor, Dr. Elena Novak, documented everything with photographs and detailed notes that would later become evidence in court. She also noted signs of chronic stress, anxiety, and what she clinically termed hypervigilance consistent with ongoing abuse. My mother underwent a medical examination as well, though she was initially reluctant. She had old fractures in her wrist and 2 ribs that had healed improperly, bruises hidden under long sleeves and high necklines. A medical history that, when examined closely, told the story of decades of violence. Dr. Novak reported everything to CPS and law enforcement as required by law. My father was charged with multiple counts of domestic assault and battery, child abuse, and terroristic threats. The judge, at his bail hearing, after reviewing the evidence and hearing from Detective Cross, set bail at $250,000 and issued a permanent restraining order prohibiting my father from coming within 500 feet of Sophie, my mother, or our home. Dad's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Marcus— no, wait, that's forbidden too. Dad's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Howard Finch, who specialized in defending the indefensible, tried to paint the whole thing as a family misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by overzealous authorities. But the photos of Sophie's bruises, the medical records, my detailed statement, and most damaging of all, the 911 recording, made that narrative impossible to maintain. The 911 call was played during the bail hearing. I'd never heard it before. Hearing Sophie's terrified voice describing what had happened, begging for help, saying she was afraid he was going to hurt her again, it broke something in me. "My dad is really angry. He hit my mom tonight and then he grabbed me and said if I ever told anyone about what goes on in our house, he'd make sure I regretted it. I'm scared. I locked myself in the bathroom, but I can hear him yelling, 'Please, I need someone to come. I don't feel safe.'" The operator's voice was calm and professional, keeping Sophie on the line, assuring her help was coming, asking if she was injured. Sophie's answers were choked with tears, but clear. Yes, he'd hurt her before. Yes, he'd hurt her mother. Yes, she was afraid of what he might do. The operator stayed on the line with her until the officers arrived. Listening to that recording, I realized that while I'd spent years being angry at my father, I'd also spent years being angry at myself for not being brave enough to do what Sophie had done. The criminal trial was set for 6 months later, but in the meantime, our lives underwent a complete transformation. My mother filed for divorce and for sole custody of Sophie. The house was sold to pay for lawyers and to give Mom a fresh start. They moved into a small apartment across town, and I helped them move, hauling boxes and furniture, trying to build a new normal from the wreckage of the old one. Sophie started seeing a therapist, Dr. Patricia Whitman, who specialized in trauma and abuse recovery. The first few months were rough. Sophie had nightmares, anxiety attacks, moments where she regretted making the call that had torn our family apart. I sat with her through some of those nights, reminding her that she hadn't torn anything apart. She'd revealed what was already broken. Dr. Whitman worked with Sophie on understanding that the abuse was never her fault, that she'd been incredibly brave, and that healing would take time but was possible. She also worked with my mother, who was grappling with her own complex feelings about the dissolution of her marriage and her role in not protecting her children sooner. As for me, I ended up in therapy too, working through 22 years of accumulated trauma, guilt, and anger. My therapist, Dr. James Volkoff, helped me understand that I'd been a victim too, that children who grow up in abusive households often develop survival mechanisms that look like complicity, but are actually self-preservation. The trial finally arrived in November. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Lisa Thornton, was a woman in her mid-30s with a reputation for being fierce in the courtroom and compassionate with victims. She'd built an ironclad case, the medical evidence, the 911 recording, testimony from Sophie, my mother, and me, statements from neighbors who'd heard fights through the walls but had never wanted to get involved, even testimonies from some of Dad's co-workers who'd witnessed his anger issues at work, though they'd always been quick to excuse it as passion or dedication. Dad's lawyer tried every angle. He painted Sophie as a troubled teenager who'd fabricated abuse to get attention. He suggested my mother was an unreliable witness with a grudge. He attempted to discredit me as a bitter son with exaggerated grievances. But when Sophie took the stand and, in a clear, steady voice, described years of violence and fear, described the night she'd finally called 911 because she couldn't take it anymore, the jury saw the truth. Dad's defense crumbled further when they played video from his interrogation at the police station. In it, when Detective Cross confronted him with the evidence and gave him a chance to explain, my father had lost his temper. He'd started yelling about how his family was weak, how he'd been too soft on them, how they'd betrayed him after all he'd done for them. It was a confession, dressed up as a rant. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. My father was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with credit for time served and possibility of parole after 5 years with good behavior. He was also ordered to pay restitution for therapy costs and medical expenses, and to have no contact with Sophie until she turned 18 and could decide for herself if she ever wanted to see him again. I watched him being led away in handcuffs, and I felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just exhaustion and relief that it was finally over. Sophie graduated high school 2 years later with honors and a full scholarship to college. She'd gone through hell and come out the other side stronger. She became an advocate for other abuse survivors, speaking at schools about the importance of breaking silence and seeking help. My mother rebuilt her life, found a job she loved at a nonprofit, started dating a kind man who treated her with the respect she'd never gotten from my father. She still struggled with guilt about not leaving sooner, not protecting us better. But therapy helped her understand that she'd been a victim too, trapped in a cycle that's far easier to judge from the outside than to escape from the inside. As for me, I finished college and went into social work, specifically helping young men who'd grown up in violent households. I wanted to be for other kids what I wished someone had been for me. Someone who understood, who didn't judge, who could help them see that the violence wasn't normal and they didn't have to accept it as their reality. 3 years after the trial, Sophie called me on a Saturday morning. "He's up for parole next month," she said without preamble. "They want to know if I want to submit a victim impact statement about whether he should be released." I asked her what she wanted to do. "I want to tell them no. I want to tell them he's dangerous and I'm still afraid of him, and I don't think he's changed at all." She paused. "But I also want to tell them that I'm okay now, that what he did to us doesn't define me anymore, that I survived, and I'm building a good life, and his violence didn't break me." "Those two things aren't mutually exclusive," I said. "You can acknowledge that you've healed while still saying he shouldn't be released. Your healing doesn't depend on forgiving him or minimizing what he did." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Will you write one too? A statement?" "Yes, absolutely." We both submitted statements to the parole board. Mine detailed the long-term impact of growing up in a violent household, the years of therapy it took to unlearn the toxic patterns I'd internalized, the way I still sometimes flinched at sudden movements or loud voices. Sophie's statement was powerful and clear. She described her ongoing journey of healing, her advocacy work, and her firm belief that our father remained a danger to anyone vulnerable in his orbit. The parole board denied his request. He'd serve at least 2 more years before he could apply again. I didn't feel victorious about it. I just felt sad that it had come to this, that a man who could have been a good father, who'd had every opportunity and advantage, had chosen violence over love, control over compassion. 5 years after the trial, I got a letter from my father. It was forwarded through his lawyer, since he wasn't allowed direct contact. The letter was short. He said he'd been going to anger management classes in prison, that he'd had time to reflect on his actions, that he was sorry for the pain he'd caused. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to minimize what he'd done. He just said he was sorry and that he hoped someday I'd be able to remember him as more than the worst version of himself. I showed the letter to Dr. Volkov during our session. "What do you want to do with this?" he asked. "I don't know. Part of me wants to believe he's changed. Part of me thinks it's just another manipulation. Those can both be true. He might have genuine remorse and still be fundamentally unchanged. People are complex." I kept the letter but didn't respond. Maybe someday I would, or maybe I wouldn't. That was my choice to make, and I'd learned that I didn't owe anyone, not even my father, access to my life or my forgiveness. Sophie is 23 now. She graduated college, works for a victims advocacy organization, and is one of the most resilient people I know. We talk every week, and sometimes we talk about that day when she made the 911 call that changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked her once. "Making the call?" She thought about it. "No, never. I regret that it had to happen. I regret that we lived in that situation for so long. I regret that Mom didn't leave sooner and that you had to go through everything you went through. But calling 911, that was the best decision I ever made. It saved my life, maybe literally." She was right. Studies show that domestic violence tends to escalate over time. Who knows what would have happened if she hadn't made that call? My father had been getting more violent in the months leading up to Sophie's call, more unhinged, more willing to lash out with greater force. Sophie had broken the cycle at exactly the right moment, even if she hadn't known it at the time. I think about that sometimes, how close we came to a different, darker ending. How many families never make that call, never break the silence, just keep living with the violence until something irreversible happens. My father's favorite saying was, "What happens at home stays at home." It was his way of maintaining control, of keeping us isolated and afraid. But Sophie's 911 call proved that some things are too important to stay home, that sometimes breaking the silence is the most courageous thing you can do, that speaking up isn't betrayal, it's survival. My father thought he could keep his violence hidden behind closed doors forever. He thought fear and shame would keep us silent. He thought family loyalty meant accepting abuse without protest. He was wrong. That 911 call Sophie made at 16 years old did more than just bring police to our house that afternoon. It shattered the illusion of the perfect Brennan family. It exposed the rot that had been festering for decades. It gave us all permission to finally tell the truth. My father lost everything he'd spent years building: his reputation, his freedom, his family. Not because Sophie destroyed it with a false accusation, but because she revealed what was always true. The violence was real. The abuse was real. The fear was real. And we didn't have to live with it anymore just because he said so. Some people in our extended family still think Sophie should have kept quiet, that she ruined our father's life over discipline or tough love. But those people weren't there. They didn't see the bruises or hear the threats or feel the terror of never knowing when the next explosion would come. Sophie didn't ruin our father's life. She saved ours. Today, I work with kids who are living the same nightmare I lived. I see the same fear in their eyes, the same shame, the same belief that somehow the violence is their fault. And I tell them Sophie's story. I tell them that one brave phone call can change everything, that asking for help isn't weakness, it's strength, that breaking the silence might be the hardest thing they ever do, but it's also the most important. My father said, "What happens at home stays at home." But my sister's 911 call made sure it didn't. And because of her courage, 3 people escaped a lifetime of violence and got the chance to heal. That's not a family destroyed. That's a family saved. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.